Good morning, everybody. This is Roger Durling, Executive Director of the Santa Barbara International Film Festival, and I am so excited that we have with us the filmmakers of the Academy Award-nominated documentary, My Octopus Teacher, director Pippa Ehrlich and James Reed. As I mentioned, the film is nominated for the Academy Award for Best Documentary. It just won the Producers Guild of America Award for Outstanding Producer of Documentary Motion Pictures. It also won Best Cinematography and Best Science Documentary, Nature Documentary, and was nominated for Best Narration and Best Documentary at the Critics' Choice Documentary Awards. Welcome, Pippa and James. Congratulations on all the well-deserved awards you've been getting for this film.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
No, absolutely. Pippa, I want to start with you. One of the things I greatly admire about the film is that you deal with issues, environmental issues. You deal with the spirituality and through our connection with nature, but you never hit us over the head on those subjects. They seem to be embedded and entrenched. How difficult was to achieve that?
I think it wasn't. We had this incredibly emotional story about a connection between a human being and the natural world. So from that point of view, we had all the right ingredients to do that. I think what was difficult was having the confidence to go ahead with that decision, because there are some very pressing environmental issues that we could have gone into to make this a more kind of overtly conservation film. We could have spoken about the fact that kelp forests are one of the most fragile ecosystems on the planet and are disappearing all over the world. We could have spoken about the fact that there's an octopus fishery in South Africa that is entangling whales every year. There were big issues that we could have gone into and kind of exposed, but for us, I suppose we just wanted to take a different approach to conservation storytelling. And we felt like there was something in our story about the way that Craig engaged with the natural world and with the octopus that would give a sense of kind of hope and awe and wonder to people. And I think that was more important to us than putting out an argument of facts for why we should be protecting nature. And I think what's not so often talked about when in conservation storytelling is what is the value of nature when we're not talking about resource use, for example, and what does it mean for our spiritual and physical and mental well-being. And this is something that is very, very important to Craig, and he's the process of that relationship with the octopus was so transformative for him, and something that he told me about long before we ever spoke about making a film. And that was what resonated with me the deepest. So yeah, it was just a risky approach because it was unconventional, I suppose. And of course, getting people to care about oceans and fall in love with kelp forests is very, very important to us.
But Pippa, you mentioned there were things that you mentioned, including the whales, etc. Yeah. You had that footage, but then at some point you decided that to not show that aspect, correct?
We did, and there were various reasons for that. I think I wanted to make a film that was universal. I didn't want to make a film that was specific to conservation crises in South Africa or conservation crises that only related to octopuses. We wanted to make a film that every single human being could relate to and could feel like they were part of the story of. And I think the amazing thing about human beings in the natural world is that every single one of us, whether we think about it or not, has an integral relationship to nature. We are completely and utterly dependent upon it. And if you open yourself in a more emotional, even spiritual way to nature, it has a profound impact on your being, So
Correct.
yeah, that was, yeah. Exactly.
James, one of the powerful things about the documentary is the fact that Craig is speaking to us directly about his personal journey. And he's an established documentary filmmaker himself. Can you tell us about was that an easy choice to decide, let's put him in front of the camera, let's have him lead us through this story?
Well, not an easy, I mean, there are no really easy choices in any film that you make, and there definitely weren't in this one. I think it was relatively easy, though, at the point that I came into it. So I was quite late on in the process. And I think that it gave me a sort of a unique opportunity, because I didn't know Craig, and I wasn't as familiar with the story or the environment. So I came in quite naive about the subject matter and about him. And I think that, you know, therefore the circumstances sort of, because I had a curiosity about lots of things that are already well known among Pippa and Craig and the rest of the team. And also it seemed clear, I mean, Pippa and I talked a lot about it when I came on board, and it was clear that at that point, that's kind of what the film needed. It sort of, it lacked a sort of an authentic voice to go with this incredible true story that he had captured on film himself. Now, yeah, so it was an obvious choice to go to Craig and to put it into his own words. We wanted to have Craig's story as told by Craig. And it was also sort of, the benefits were obvious for me to do it as somebody new to the situation and could be genuinely exploring the truth about what happened and what it meant to him. It's a much more straightforward and honest relationship to have on camera if your interviewer genuinely doesn't know the things he's trying to find out, or she. But I suppose, I mean, I think what you're asking a little bit, the other side of that is that Craig is a filmmaker, and he has experience with the process of making films and the interview process even. So I think what the test was, or the challenge was, to sort of I mean, this is part of the reason, there were other reasons, but part of the reason I kept my contact with Craig very minimal before I met him and did the interviews. So we had one Skype chat just to check out that, you know, he thought I was okay and he sort of bought into this process. But we didn't talk about the Octopus hardly at all. Pippa and I did a bit on the side, but I tried to keep it pretty fresh, because I knew that if I was too prescriptive about the process, he would see that if I was a bit too sort of planning it and it was a bit too overproduced, he's a producer himself, and he'd see that coming a mile off. So I tried to go into it completely without much intention, actually. I mean, I knew that I wanted to sort of get him telling the entire story, and I knew that we needed to allocate enough time to do that in whatever meandering way it was going to happen. But I wanted sort of, you know, complete sort of frankness and authenticity and spontaneity from him. So I didn't want to sort of go about it in a more standard, predictable way. Mm-hmm. So I knew it was going to be, it might be tricky, but actually Craig was very good at just sort of, he's good at compartmentalizing. And I think this was such a personal story, like his experience of filming the Octopus was not really one of a typical producer. You know, he'd done films that he'd very much produced before, whereas this was him on his own, just documenting experiences he was having. So he'd approached his whole relationship and the filming of that in a very unconventional way anyway. And it was his personal life I was asking him about, not a work project. And it really felt like that, actually. So I didn't feel like I was sat across the table from a fellow filmmaker who was in on it. I was sat across the table from somebody who happened to be a filmmaker, but it was actually his personal story. And you know, everybody has that. Even if you're involved in film, you still have a side to your life that's just very personal, and you can talk about it. So actually the challenges of sort of doing that with somebody who kind of understood the process a bit more, weren't nearly as it wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be, and he was just fantastic, and we got on, and he really just got sucked into it, and his strength as well. And I think because I didn't know the story and he knew I was asking fresh, we were able to go back to those, in his mind, he was in those moments at the start of a relationship that he very much knew how it concluded. But during the interview, he really was reliving stages of that relationship, and really, burying himself in it, and it really worked.
Yeah. Pippa, you came in the process. Can you explain to us when you came in the process? Because Craig had been shooting, for years. I think you can correct me. He has done about 3,000 hours of footage underwater. Tell us when you came in and the process.
So I came in, I met Craig about 6 years ago through a mutual friend that said, well, I've been having these amazing dives in the kelp forest, and we're not wearing wetsuits, and I've been going with this guy called Craig Foster. He's a filmmaker. Come and dive with me. And from that very first dive, I've been diving in Cape Town for 13, 14 years now. And I thought that I knew the environment, but from that very first time in the water with Craig, I realized that he was tuned in to something that I hadn't really seen in person before. He was able to see signs and find animals and recognize behaviors, and it just completely blew my mind. And then about a year and a half later, I said to him, look, I'm really interested in learning about cold thermogenesis, which is the process of adapting your body to the cold. And I was just fascinated by how he was finding all those animals in the kelp forest, because although I was diving regularly, I just wasn't seeing the things that he could see. So I started diving with him, and about 6 months into that process, he said to me, he kind of told me about his relationship with the octopus, and I had a sense of how important it had been to him, but he'd never told me the whole story from beginning to end. And he sat me down and he told me this incredible story, and a few days later sent me a treatment when I was sitting at my desk, and just started crying, because there was something in there that it just resonated with me like nothing else I'd ever seen. And then we started going through the rushes, and I was seeing shots of octopuses picking up shells like a creature out of Transformers, and reaching out and touching his face, and shots of them swimming together, like dancing together underwater. And I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And there was just absolutely no way that I could say no to getting involved with the film. Of course, at that time, we had absolutely no budget. We had a film about a man and an octopus, which on paper is not a very easy, project to sell. So we worked for about a year and a half in Craig's attic, and we just believed in this thing and kept going. And eventually we got a distribution partner on board, which is Off the Fence, and our EP Ellen Windermouth, and we worked a long time with her. And we got to the stage, as James mentioned earlier, where we knew we had this really powerful story, and the few people who watched it were having a powerful reaction to it. But we were at that point so deeply immersed in it, we couldn't see the wood for the trees anymore. And we played with the idea of doing an interview with Craig, but it's really hard to interview someone who you know so well. So yeah, at that point we needed a more objective eye, and we were really, really lucky that the film landed on James's desk.
Mm-hmm. But I do have a follow-up question about the cold immersion. Yeah. So you while you were shooting, leading to that, you actually had to train how to actually do what Craig was doing.
Yeah, so I mean, of course, most of the footage was already in the can before I came onto the project at all, because by the time I got involved, the octopus had died already. but there were different scenes that we needed. We needed shots of Craig in the forest. We needed shots of other animals. We needed beautiful general visuals of the kelp forest itself. And Craig said, and looking back now, I mean, it was pretty crazy. He said he wants to keep making this film according to, you know, the process that he'd been in for a few years already at that stage, which meant no wetsuits and no scuba gear. So, and yeah, I had, but at that point, you know, I'd spent months and months going into the water 20 minutes a day, every day. And then it got easier and easier and easier. And 6 months in, I can easily dive for an hour and a half now. But
Well,
yeah, I think,
but
yeah.
but just one technical thing is when you go and dive in, how much time can you be underwater before you have to catch your next breath?
2 minutes is a very long dive.
Wow.
So it's, if you think of a shot in a film, 30 seconds is a really long shot, but you'd be surprised. If you lay down on the floor and hold your breath, you'd be amazed how long you could hold it for.
Well, I would never dare to try something like that. James, once you had the interviews with Craig, how did the story started taking shape?
Well, I mean, a lot of the, as Pippa says, a lot of the story elements were in really good shape in the original cut that I'd seen that had been sent to me. I mean, they you know, like the process of going through 3,000 hours, you know, he's in there every day across a year, and he's got such incredible access to this one octopus that even though she was very difficult to track and find initially, and at other times in her life, there were periods when she was. But when she was around and she was interested in him, she's very easy to film because she's not making any effort to hide herself from him. So there's all that process of sort of reducing down that enormous amount of sort of story options and potential had come down to some really strong building blocks already. I mean, I suppose the difference, I mean, it's when you do something that is just purely interview based, you're not writing a word of narration, you're just using the story that's been told to you. I mean, I find, and I think, you know, I mean, Pippa will agree with this, I'm sure, you know, at times it's a bit frustrating because, you know, there's a bit of a story that we want to tell in a particular way, and it's just not how it came out in the interview. So if you were approaching the film in a different way, you would have written the script and adjusted it so that it fit with whatever footage that you were so keen to show. But it's actually quite sort of liberating being restricted to, well, this is Craig's story and this is how he told it. And so it's, while how it unraveled in the interview, there were many bits that were quite similar to the original cut, but there were lots of new things as well, as there always is in any sort of interview. You know, you think you're going for particular subjects, but inevitably the real bits of sort of charm and charisma and interest and passion, you know, people can go off on tangents or have a sudden thought, and it makes it, you know, that those are the bits that make you really lean in when you're watching something, where you can see something's really occurring to them in the moment. And so those did have an influence over the sort of story structure. So we went back to Bristol, and Pippa and I worked with, you know, the interview footage. It wasn't 3,000 hours. It was nowhere near as much as the underwater footage, but it's a huge amount of footage considering it's a 90-minute film. So we then had to go through and pick out the most sort of significant and pivotal moments in that relationship and the things that spoke to the most important themes of the film. And it's like you're sculpting something down to the sort of essence of the story, and it's quite a gradual process. And then it's about, you know, this is going to fit with the footage in a completely different way, because as soon as you introduce, you know, you've just added another sort of dimension to the film. And you know, editing with an interview, you know, you can do it in a very simple way and just get back and forth between the two. But when it really works, you're finding really interesting joins and things between, you know, his tone of voice and his body movements with the pictures. So there's lots of there's lots of new things to consider, and we basically sort of, like I say, lots of the story points that were there originally were kind of maintained and were very similar in the next version of it. But we kind of had the approach that we were recutting the film around that conversation. So it did end up quite similar in some ways, but it was important for us to we had to put Craig as the spine first and then build onto that rather than sort of try and fit the interview into the film. So yeah, it was arduous, but it came together really well because he was fantastic and it was all from the heart. And like I say, I mean, Pippa had done a fantastic job previously of sort of isolating and identifying all these really interesting events in the Octopus's life that had been recorded. So it was a very close match in many ways, and it was a lot of fun.
Pippa, the opening sequence, I've seen the film a couple of times, and I was watching it again last night, and I was admiring greatly the way in the opening you suck us right in. We get immediately involved, and I know that is the sequence where he's evading the sharks and then he goes up for air. Can you tell us about arriving to that opening moment?
I think that's a story James and me have to tell together because we went back and forth on it so many times. I mean, I think cutting the opening of a film is always the hardest because you never know how to begin. You never know how much information your audience is going to need in order to get sucked into the story. But I think, we had a sense of what the most compelling images would be, and we had a sense of, I remember James and I talking about what kinds of lines do we need at the beginning of this film to suck people into the story. And I think you should jump in here as well, James.
Well, I think, just as Pippa says, it was sort of, it actually came quite late in the process of sort of, because I think you've trying to, I always find trying to cut the opening of a film at the start is it never really works. You're always going to revisit it and do something different by the time you've been through the film and it's really started to come through what the real story is. And I think that we did leave it pretty, it wasn't the last thing that we cut on that next edit, but it was quite late on in the process. And I think by that point, there's a number of practical reasons, because you've sort of been through all the interview and you've listened to these lines that are like, wow, they don't quite go anywhere, but they really sum up the sort of the challenge, the conflict in him and the struggle with this relationship in sort of quite a high concept way. That might be a bit too high concept when he's actually talking about it in the main body of the film, but we just kept on identifying sort of little lines like that felt like, they kind of tease what this thing is all about without being too explicit about the things that are happening. And then of course you're identifying all that sort of imagery that again captures all the main threads and themes and interesting things about the film all the way through. So about 3/4 of the way through the process, we gave a pre-title scene a go, and it's really interesting. It's sort of like we did agonize. We talked quite a lot about it, Pippa, but actually that first cut of it just kind of worked, and I think it's because we had left it till quite late in the process. And there was a few changes after that, and a couple of shots changed out, but it just kind of captured it, and it came at a time where we felt, this is it. It's saying enough, but it's not saying too much, and it's sort of, I think we were. It was.
We had a challenge because to get to the Octopus story, we had to get through 48 years of Craig's life. And that's a difficult thing to put into 5-6 minutes, which is what we arrived at. So that was we needed people to know a sense of what they were in for.
Correct. And it also, and you feel like you're dropped in the middle of the story, and it definitely intrigues you, and
I think I think that's an interesting point, Pippa. Yeah, like because I think it was the result of the trickiest bit is the post title is sort of like where the story actually starts, and that really was sort of we agonized over that. There's how far back do you go? And always on any film, it's like where do we start? And like you kind of try and start as late as you possibly can, but like there was background information to his life to understand him and what motivated him to do it. So that really was a really tricky area of the film. The post-title bit. The pre-title was a bit more straightforward, and it alleviated some of the pressure on the post-title bit, because we were, this sort of conflict of like, well, we need to get this information in because you really need to know this about Craig, but then there's a compromise to be made, because if we're spending too much time learning about Craig, we're delaying the time when he gets into the water and he begins. And so you're making some sacrifice on one part or the other where you start that story. But the thing about having the pre-title that kind of, like you say, dropped you in the middle, right at the heart of what was great and difficult about this relationship, and having the freedom just to not, it was hardly sequential, really. It was just kind of a hit of all the main ingredients of the film, and that alleviated some pressure, and we felt more confident to go, okay, well, we can go back earlier now and sort of understand a bit more about Craig, where he was coming from, and we can afford to go into the story in a more gentle way, because it is a little bit, this sounds a little bit cynical, but you are worried about holding people's attention at the start of the film. First 5 minutes is critical, and it's a
strange film. it's a unique kind of storyline that it's hard to explain on the little Netflix description.
One of the things, Pippa, that I found very compelling about the film is that you have the story of the Octopus and Craig, of course, but then you also have this other love story, which is Tom and Craig. And can you tell us about when did both of you started to understand that was essential to the story?
I mean, in even the very early cuts of the film, Tom was included because at the same time that Craig started, he realized he needed to change his life, and a main motivating factor for him was he wanted to be present, as a father and as a husband as well, which we didn't go into that part of the story too much. But and a big part of moving to the coast was that he could spend hours and hours in nature with his son. And when I started diving with Craig, we'd go out with Tom, and he's just he's like an amphibious being himself. He's completely, I feel, as safe with Tom as with anyone in the water. He's incredibly strong swimmer. He understands waves. He understands animals. He's had crazy experiences of diving with sharks since he was like 7 or 8 years old. So he actually, you could almost make a whole film about Tom. So I think it was always a really important part of the film, and always really, really important to Craig. And I think as the story developed and the theme of kind of new generations and passing things on comes in towards the end of the film, it just fit really, really nicely, because Craig has mentored many, many people in nature immersion, but certainly his most intensive mentoring has happened with his son since he was a little boy.
James, a super geeky question. I love the sound design. I want to point out one sequence, the brittle star sequence. You hear the sound of the brittle stars, then you also hear bubbles, and then on top of that you hear the narration. Can you tell us about the sound design of the film?
Well, I'm going to pass that off to Pippa.
Okay.
I would say that when I write, Pippa and Craig had been obviously heavily committed to interesting soundscapes from the very beginning, and that was something that was quite really compelling from the stuff that I'd seen. And you know, too often, you know, underwater films are tricky because, you know, there is loads of real sound down there, but it's very difficult recording it, and so you do get a real mixture of sort of soundscapes used on marine and underwater films out there. So it's always a very interesting part of any underwater film. And on the first cut I saw, I was very sort of reassured and enjoyed the sound design that they did then. But I know that Pippa went, you know, they went much further in the end, and she'll have a lot more to say about it.
You know, what was when you were you know, doing the video, the visuals, you were also recording the soundscapes?
Some of it, but our sound designer, Barry Donnelly, actually has a long, he and Craig grew up together. So he's been diving with Craig and his brother in the kelp forest since they were all little boys together. So it was pretty incredible that, I mean, Barry and Craig they worked together on Craig's very first film 20 years ago. So Barry kind of knows how Craig thinks, but he just went completely the extra mile. He came out with us, went diving with Craig, recorded sounds underwater, recorded sounds of Craig swimming and breathing and finning. He did things like collecting masses and masses of kelp stipes and taking them back to his studio and recording them in different pitches and making sounds with that. Our composer, Kevin, also made entire soundscapes only from kelp forest sounds. And Craig's son is Tom. He's a really good musician, so he recorded a lot of the sounds and warped them and changed them. And yeah, the sound was a really, really fun process. We had an incredible post-production team between Barry Donnelly and Kevin Smits and our colorist Kyle. And interestingly, the brittle stars, I'm really glad you picked that up, because that was another layer of sound that we did later with a percussionist called Ronan, who has all of these crazy instruments from all over the world, and some of them are things you'd recognize and some of them are things you never would. And he and I sat and we just went through different scenes in the film and just tried different things. And there was something about the brittle stars that just worked with a particular instrument that he had.
Mm-hmm. I just was so enthralled by listening to the you guys call it soundscapes. It's very rich. It's a very rich experience, which also, you know, it goes hand in hand with how gorgeous the whole film it looks. How difficult was it to make sure that all the different footage match? You know, we had Jane's footage, we had your footage, Pippa, and then we had years of footage that Craig had.
Yeah, well, we were scared when we realized how much we had to match us. Maybe James can explain how natural history filmmaking works, and when you don't have formats that match.
I mean, I think, you know, it's always hard. Like you say, it's on a drama or even a documentary when you've got a more predictable setting. I mean, there's always challenges and great things you can do with coloring to match things or contrast things where you want to. On natural history generally is a really tricky thing to sort of get right, because, you know, even over the course of sort of an hour, something, you know, natural environment can look very different, and all the color balance is just completely different. You introduce that a bunch of different formats and footage that's been shot over a year and beyond, and it's a huge task. But I mean, I think, you know, and again, I think, you know, Pippa was totally across all the final post, and we'll tell you more about the challenges within the grade itself. But I'd say that, you know, we did embrace the differences in those cameras. I think it's always a bit of a mistake, and it wouldn't have been in keeping with the approach of the film to try and sort of like mix and match things. You know, that wasn't really the purpose. You know, Craig, when he was filming in those early days, he was at least the first half of the relationship, he was filming on his own, and he was using his own small format camera that actually generated surprisingly good pictures, and he's very, very good at it, and he's very natural in the water. But it's not, when you start editing with it with a 4K red camera operated by an underwater professional like Roger Horrocks, who filmed a lot of the latter half, it's like chalk and cheese. They're very, very different. But we embraced that because we wanted to follow the truth of the story naturally, and we were very much focused on using Craig's sort of POV and footage taken on that camera in the early stages of the relationship. Now later on, we didn't acknowledge it in the film, but it's not, I mean, it didn't make a lot of difference to the story anyway. But later on, his good friend Roger Horrocks, who happens to be a fantastic underwater cameraman, one of the best in the world, he just lives down the road, and Craig was still saying, Roger, you got to come and see this octopus. This is incredible. We should film some stuff. If you've got some free time, come down. And that was the start of Roger being involved in this quite regularly. And it came at a point in the film where it was nice to get a different sort of type of footage. And suddenly we had kind of different angles, but we weren't sort of intercutting them. We were sort of using sequences of Craig's stuff and then a batch of Roger's, and there were certain events, like when the sharks were more involved in the story later on, where having Roger's coverage was just incredible. And it just, it felt like the film's sort of look kind of gradually changed across the year, rather than trying to mix things together at each stage. So I think we gave the film less challenges in terms of mixing different formats because of how the story was told and the focus of different bits of footage throughout the film. But still, I mean, like I say, light conditions are the main thing, and there were scenes where those two formats were cut. And I remember being in the offline and thinking, this will be a challenge. But you can do, I mean, that is, it's not visual effects, it's honest. They are the pictures they are. But you work on the color and the textures of pictures a lot, so that not so that you're giving an impression that's false of what was happening, but so you're not distracting the audience. I think that's always the aim, is to sort of like give them a sort of a greater sense of what it's like. The last thing you want to do is to have, on some level, people watching not quite follow it, because there's a difference in pictures they're a bit distracted by. So it's a way of smoothing that out. But Pippa, I mean, she was sat in the grade in Cape Town having all that fun, so she'll tell you about it.
Yeah. No, we were just lucky that Kyle Strobel was an incredible colorist and very determined and very patient. And
Pippa, Craig obviously spent a lot of time in the ecosystem every day, and you joined as well. Through this process, how did your perception of animal cognition and intelligence change?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. And it completely changes. And it doesn't just change because of encounters that you have with big animals, or particularly charismatic animals like octopuses or otters. I mean, when a wild animal approaches you and looks you in the eyes and swims around you and allows you into its space, or comes into your space, which is often what happens, you immediately start to question kind of everything you think about how animals are. And you get this deep sense of, this creature is as curious about me as I am about it. And that immediately makes you think in a completely different way. But more than that, when you start going into the more subtle biology, even of something as simple as an animal like a limpet, which just looks like a shell sticking on a rock, and you start hearing stories about how these animals are gardeners, and they literally are growing a little patch of algae around themselves so that they can feed themselves. And you start looking at the shells, and you could tell by the shape of the shell that, go back into the history of the animal and tell that when it was small, it lived on a very, very cramped space. And as it got bigger, it was able to expand and its shell got flatter. You start to realize that every single creature on Earth has a phenomenally interesting life, and is fighting all kinds of struggles to stay alive. And I guess, and this is something that James and I spoke about a lot. I mean, if you can have that kind of relationship with an octopus, what else is possible?
Hmm. Well said. It's such a powerful film. James, I could go on talking to you guys for a very long time, and I've kept you for so long. What do you want people to get out of this watching your film?
I don't have a clear and simple summary of that, and I think we talked so much about that, and this taps into lots of different subjects that were great debate for us, healthy but debate all the way through the process. And you talked about one before about whether we wanted to have a sort of an explicitly environmental message, and like Pippa said earlier, it wasn't that we wanted to turn our back on those like important environmental issues. We just felt that what we had was something that was a bit more universal, and hopefully that had its own sort of, we did feel confident that if we stuck to the really strong bit of what our story was and really focused on the amazing potential of this relationship with the natural world and what that really said about our potential as a species to relate in a different way to the natural world, we kind of felt that was so much of a bigger, sort of more ambitious message in a way than any specific environmental issue, whether it be local or international. We just felt actually this does have an environmental message, but it is very broad and it's very universal, and we don't have to talk about it. And I think that once we found that confidence and won everybody else's confidence to approach the film like that, then it was quite simple, and we didn't sort of try and overthink exactly what it is we want people to think. I mean, that's kind of an odd thing to say, because obviously making a film is a process of wondering how the audience are going to respond to certain bits, and trying to understand what the viewer response is helps where then it's very important to consider at all times. But we also knew that this could have really broad appeal, and people have different backgrounds and interests and philosophies, and they are going to respond to very different things in the film. And I think we hoped that would be the case. Actually, there would be something that anybody who had a relationship with anything and had any sort of interest in their relationship with the natural world, or in how they should be empathizing with other people or with other animals, that it would trigger some sort of thought process and get people thinking and talking about our place in the world and our relationship with nature. And I think, that it's very broad and non-specific sort of thing, but we felt that was good. That was sort of, it could get anybody from any walk of life sort of thinking about it. And that felt like the strongest thing we had to offer.
And Pippa, I mentioned to you earlier, I haven't met a single person who hasn't seen your film who doesn't get emotional talking about it. Did that come to you as a surprise that people are so emotionally connected to the film?
The scale of the response has been utterly overwhelming and surprising. I don't think maybe it's because it's my first film, and maybe it's because I live on the tip of Africa. But to have something go out into the world like that, and wake up the morning after it launches and just have every inbox full, and Sea Change, the organization that we work for, getting an email every 3 seconds, and that was surprising and overwhelming. But I think there were some scenes in that film where even when I was cutting them, I was pretty much crying at my desk, and there were things I showed Craig during the process, and he got tearful. So if you already know what's going to happen, and you're having an emotional response to the material, I think I think we knew we had an emotional film. We just didn't know that how many people would relate to it.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think all the way, I think really the simple, I think we felt strongly emotionally connected to it. Like Pippa said, everybody on the team had a very strong emotional response to it. The story is objectively a very emotional and engaging one. That was clear, and I think we did know that if we even did a half decent job of telling it, that the people would respond emotionally to it. What we had absolutely no idea about was how many people would watch it, and I think that really was the huge surprise. And you know, we started to get a feeling for that because Netflix came on quite late in the process, and they were extremely helpful when they did, and the film still went through some changes with them on board. But they, you know, we were even a long time after I came on board, we were working in isolation, and then so everything changed when Netflix commissioned it. Then it was suddenly like, all right, people, yes, quite a decent audience are going to watch this, but there's no guarantee that loads of people watch it. You know, maybe no one would come to it, and we still didn't know. So we just had we never dreamt that so many people would watch it, and I think that's the real surprise. And partly, you know, it is partly the year that we came out in the middle of a global pandemic when everyone was locked down, and the film took on a different meaning for people who were locked away at home and yearning for something different and feeling, you know, I think there's nobody who didn't at one point feel like their relationship wasn't going, that any human relationship that they had, whether it be with work or be with their family, they were either seeing too much of their family or not enough. And like, you know, so there were things in the film that I think probably meant more to people at that time. And Netflix did, you know, Netflix are an amazing platform and did an amazing job. And suddenly loads of people are watching it and having the response that we had hoped and kind of expected in terms of the emotional response anyway. But it was just like many
Scale.
more people. Yeah, so a few more people than we'd expected.
I mean, I definitely, speaking for myself, I watching your film, it made me totally change my mind about my relationship to the natural world, and it's such a eye-opening experience watching your film. It's so beautiful. And now you guys are Oscar nominated.
I know, it's very weird for us.
Well,
yeah.
Well, you guys have been amazing to chat with. Thank you so much. Congratulations on the nomination, and congratulations on such an amazing documentary. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you so much for making time for us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.